The episode begins with the classic previously in X-Men, but notice it's Jean's voice. In the original series, Scott, the leader, always did this introduction. In the last episode, it was Magneto to indicate a change in leadership. In this episode, it's Jean, implying the story will focus on her. I'm going to explain the comic book story this episode is based on and why Chris Claremont, a longtime X-Men writer, hated having to write this story. You likely all know the Phoenix saga, when Jean Grey got possessed by a flaming space bird that turned her into an almost goddess-like heroine. In the comics and the series, the Phoenix drove Jean insane and consumed an entire star system. Eventually, Jean was sentenced to death and decided to end her own life before the Phoenix could kill again. In the series, she was resurrected with the life forces of different X-Men members, but in the comics, her death was intended to be permanent. Chris Claremont, who wrote the X-Men for 16 years, believed in long story arcs with real consequences, but he still wanted to give a happy ending to Cyclops and write him out of the story so that new heroes could be introduced. So he created Madeline Prior, a woman very much like Jean Grey. Eventually, she and Scott got married, had a son, Nathan, and moved to Alaska. But then the Marvel editorial team, looking at Gene Schuster, decided they wanted a new team with the original X-Men. Not only did Claremont have to bring Jean Grey back, but he also had to give a reason for Cyclops to leave his wife. And it all gets quite complicated. I'll explain some specific points from the comics as we go along, but briefly, Scott founded a team called X Factor, and Madeline joined the X-Men. Even though she didn't have any powers, it's eventually revealed that Madeline is a clone of Jean Grey created by Mr. Sinister, exactly as we see in this episode. When the Phoenix sacrificed itself on the moon, a piece of the Phoenix entered Madeline, giving her some of Jean's memories and powers. In time, Madeline goes insane and makes a deal with a demon, becoming the villain known as the Queen of the End. There was a big crossover event called Hell, where two demons opened a portal over Manhattan and started turning the city into a living hell. At one point, Madeline even tries to sacrifice her own son to keep the portal open, but she is finally defeated and dies, and then, of course, returns in a later issue. After all, in comics, nobody dies. Personally, I've never been a big fan of the Madeline saga because I think it diminishes death when comic book characters keep coming back to life. And X-Men writer Chris Claremont shares the same view. But I have to be honest, in this series, I think they've adapted it really well, and that sets up an even darker story that will come later in the season. I'll explain everything as we go along and answer the big question: when was Jean Grey replaced by a clone? I'll give you a hint, it was recently. But leave your theory in the comments below. Now, going back to what I was saying, just like in episode 2, the new intro has some cool changes. We see the X-Men's first fight with Magneto at the missile base, adapted from the first issue of the X-Men, and we also see the Dark Phoenix. As I mentioned before, this was a massive 9-part saga in the series in season 3. It was the most ambitious narrative ever made for a Saturday morning cartoon, when most cartoons were episodic and didn't connect into longer story arcs. We also see Robert running to the wire fence, taking Jubilee's place. I think in the last episode I said he was leaving, but I was wrong. Now it looks like he's going to stay and be a student at the school, fulfilling the role that Jubilee had in the original series. As I mentioned last week, in the comics, Roberto was one of the founding members of the New Mutants, a group of young students that Xavier trained at school. In the comics, as well as in the series, Xavier left Earth and asked Magneto to lead the team. But instead of leading the X-Men, he took on more of the role of school principal and appeared in the New Mutants comic book for about 50 issues. I'd love to see this series spawn a New Mutants series. After all, we already met Sam Gertz, aka Missile, last season when Rogue tried to recruit him. I don't think any 16-year-old would mind a visit from a nice southern girl. We met another member of the New Mutants in the original series, who was Illyana, Colossus's sister. Illyana was incredibly important in the Inferno crossover event, and she appears in this episode during the battle. Morpho transforms into Illyana twice. The first time in the New Mutants uniform as a magical character, and the second time in her other identity, Darkchild. Look, I could dive into a long explanation here, but I don't really think it's super necessary to understand this episode. To sum up, Colossus's little sister gains demonic powers, acquires the ability to teleport, and is tricked into opening a portal to Limbo during the Inferno event. If Illyana appears again in the series, I'll delve into more detail and explain a bit more when Morpho transforms into her later. We also catch a glimpse of Professor Xavier and Lilandra. Lilandra is the Empress of the galaxy-spanning Shi'ar Empire, and she and Professor Xavier are in love. In the last episode of the original series, she took him to space to save his life, much like what happened in the 200th issue of the X-Men. In fact, long before that issue, the Shi'ar cloned a new body for Professor Xavier and he was able to walk again. So if Professor X is still alive in space, he might have regained the use of his legs by the time he returns to Earth. I think seeing him in the credits is a big hint that he's going to come back, but probably not until the end of the season. Afterwards, we see Scott watching the Phoenix sacrifice on the moon. They also added a scene of Gambit and Rogue flirting on the basketball court. We saw them in these outfits in the first episode, but the same outfits are adapted from Lady Lethal's arc in the original season, which in turn was adapted in the 4th issue of the X-Men.